Hello, welcome to Coggeshall Farm. Here today to talk to you about Bristol's involvement in the Revolutionary War. So, the Revolutionary War started on April 19th, 1775 with the battles of Lexington and Concord, and news of those battles reached Rhode Island very quickly by the end of April 19th. And Rhode Island militia companies started marching toward Boston immediately, although they were stopped at the state line because the colonial government did not want their troops getting involved before they had figured out fully what was going on in Massachusetts. So the General Assembly of Rhode Island met a few days later on April 22nd and created what was known as the Army of Observation, which was an army commanded by Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, who you may have heard of. It consisted of 3 regiments, one from Providence County, one from Newport and Bristol counties, and one from Kent and Kings counties. And in the Newport and Bristol county, there were, of course, a lot of soldiers from Bristol. So there was one company in that regiment commanded by Captain Sion Martindale, who was a sea captain originally from Newport, who had moved to Bristol in the 1750s when he got married. And he lived in Bristol the rest of his life and joined the army as a captain in 1775. He and his men marched up to Boston to take part in the siege of Boston. They were not present at the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they were in the area around Boston at the time of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And they stayed there until the end of 1775 when their terms of service expired, although some of them did re-enlist in the army after their terms of service expired, and most of them came home after that. In the fall of 1775, while the troops were away at Boston, the British Royal Navy was sailing around Narragansett Bay, trying to find supplies for their sailors, and demanded a large quantity of sheep and cows in exchange for the town's safety. And when the town did not provide the required number of animals, it was fired upon by the British ships. Although there wasn't much destruction done by the ship's cannons, there were multiple buildings that were hit by cannonballs, though none of them were destroyed. The British continued to operate in the Narragansett Bay area. There was a skirmish on Prudence Island in January 1776, although the British were not fully present in Newport by that point in time. So in March 1776, the British Army evacuated Boston and moved their main force, many of them to Canada, and they also gathered a large number of troops coming directly from Britain and some from Germany, who all gathered to try to take New York City. So because of that, George Washington gathered his whole army, along with many militia units and troops from all over, to try to defend New York from the British, although he did, unfortunately for the cause of America, lose those battles and was forced to go south through New Jersey and then Pennsylvania. But one of the units that was sent to help Washington in the area of New York was Christopher Lippett's regiment from Rhode Island, which included a company commanded by Loring Peck, who was he was from Bristol. He was a son of a former militia captain of Bristol, Jonathan Peck, and there were many people from Bristol serving in his company. One of them was named John Smith. John Smith was a sergeant. There isn't much known about his life besides the fact that he did leave behind a diary that he wrote during his service, which contains many very interesting anecdotes. And my favorite one is about the company's journey from Bristol getting to New York. So the Loring Peck's company set out from Bristol for the first time in early September 1776. And they first went to Newport, where they boarded a boat to go across Narragansett Bay and to then march from there to New York. So they board the boat in Newport. They don't bring any fresh water with them, which is maybe not the best decision because you never know how long it's going to take to get across the water. And it turns out that day the wind was not very strong, so they moved very slowly and were very dehydrated by the time they got across the bay to the western shore. So they got across the bay eventually and landed on the western shore at 2 a.m. the next day. And they did not have their commanding officer with them for this entire start of their journey. They were commanded by their third in command, Ensign Joseph Reed, who made the decision to take the men under his command to the nearest tavern and buy rum for all of them. While the soldiers are drinking their rum, they are approached by a more senior officer who tells them that they need to immediately return to Newport. So they immediately get back in their boat, and the exact quote from the diary is, "without thinking to take any fresh water on board."
Oh, yeah.
And I mentioned earlier that the wind wasn't very strong pushing them across the water. Now the wind is against them.
So they had to sail tacking back and forth?
No, actually they rowed the entire way from the western shore of the bay to Newport. It took them an entire day with no fresh water, and the only food they had on board was ship's biscuits, which is what we would now call hardtack, bread that has been baked multiple times to remove all of the moisture from it, and raw pork. As they were passing by Connecticut Island, where Jamestown is, a few of the men decided to try to retrieve some water. They tied their canteens around their necks, jumped out of the boat, swam to the island, filled up their canteens, and swam back out to the boat, presumably, which was still moving this entire time, very slowly. They eventually arrive at Newport, where they are met on the dock by their captain, Loring Peck, who does not even let them get off of the boat. He just gets in the boat and tells them that they immediately need to go to Goat Island, where they are then going to garrison Fort Liberty. So they row back out to Goat Island, get out of the boat, form up into their ranks, and then they just have to stand there, once again without water, as their officers converse with the officers of the fort, trying to figure out what the accommodations for the soldiers are going to be. So that seems like a very miserable time overall, and they didn't even leave the state for any of that. They then garrison Fort Liberty for about a week, and then get in another boat to go across. This crossing was presumably less eventful, as he doesn't write about any anecdotes like this. And then they continue down to New York, where they meet George Washington at Harlem. They get there around the beginning of October, and then follow Washington's army south through New Jersey, then Pennsylvania. They aren't part of the force that crosses the Delaware River with him, although they do hear the sounds of battle from Trenton across the river while they're on the Pennsylvania side. And then Lippett's regiment was disbanded in early 1777, and those men returned home to Bristol. Some of them did see service later in the war in different Rhode Island units, but that was the end of Lippett's regiment specifically. Another participant in the war from Bristol, who we don't really know much about his service, we don't even know what unit he served in, but his name was David Wilson. He was, I believe, 22 years old, and he, the only reason we know about him is because the death record for him in the vital records lists him as killed at New York, September 1776. Not even a specific date listed. Although he did, presumably around the same time he was joining the army, realize that the service would be quite risky to his life, so he did write a will in April 1776, in which he left all of his possessions, aside from his clothes, to his 12-year-old half-sister Mary. He had no other living relatives at the time, so everything went to her, except for his clothes, which went to the male children of John Howland Jr. Then, in December 1776, while Washington's army is down in the New Jersey and Pennsylvania area, the British Navy does bring a force to Newport and capture the city of Newport, where they then have a base up until 1779. So that is when the war really gets close to Bristol, and they start to get a lot more worried here than they had been before, because the Royal Navy was patrolling and they did bombard the town, but they weren't really entrenched in the area. Now their base is very close to here. So, yes, in December 1776, a British fleet commanded by Sir Peter Parker captures Newport. And then all of the Rhode Island militia has to mobilize to patrol along the shoreline, make sure the British aren't going out on too many raiding expeditions. And the town of Bristol at this point in time only has one militia company. It consists of every able-bodied man in the town between the ages of 16 and 60, which was commanded by a few different captains throughout the war. At the very beginning of the war, it was commanded by Jeremiah Ingraham, who had commanded it for a couple of years before the start of the war. Then it was briefly commanded by Stephen Smith, and then in 1777 it was taken over by William Throop, who then commanded it until the end of the war. So they were split into 2 platoons because they needed to constantly be on watch. So they had one company that was split in 2, and each platoon would have a 1-month watch where they'd be away from home patrolling along the shoreline, and then they'd switch off at the end of the month, go back home, do their work while the other half of the company was guarding the shore. So they are doing this for years. Multiple of the pension applications of the men who were in the militia at this time list 13-month service, just on and off and on and off. So over the course of about 2 years, you end up serving 1 full year. So the militia weren't called to the front very regularly, but they were frequently away from their homes, patrolling the shoreline, making sure the British didn't try anything. Although the British did still carry out quite a few raids in the area for supplies and just to destroy rebel supplies as well. So one of those raids took place in May 1778 here in Bristol. It was on May 25th, 1778, a force of troops came up in the middle of the night from Newport, landed in between Bristol and Warren, and then marched north through Warren, destroyed a bunch of buildings, burned them down, and also arrested many civilians, and then marched south back toward Bristol, doing a lot of the same things. The quote from the Providence Gazette at the time was something like, burning and plundering all that their haste would admit. So they were trying to move as quickly as they could, but they were destroying and also arresting people. In Bristol, they were met by multiple units of Rhode Island state troops. The Continental Army didn't really have a presence in Rhode Island at the time, but there were regiments of state troops, which are somewhere in between the professionalism level of the militia and the Continental Army. So they're basically somewhat professional soldiers who enlist for a few months or a year at a time, and their job is just to guard the state where they enlist, so they don't really get deployed elsewhere outside of Rhode Island, but they are guarding the shoreline and just whatever needs to be done in Rhode Island. One of these state regiments was commanded by Colonel Archibald Crary, and there was a captain in his regiment named William Lawless, who was from Bristol. And that regiment did serve in the defense of Bristol on May 25th, 1778, and fought the British down to the shoreline, where the British did take multiple casualties on that day. And then the British got back in their boats and went back to Newport. So later that same year, the people of Bristol had a chance to get a little bit of revenge on the British soldiers who had burned their town in May. In August 1778, there was an expedition commanded by Major General John Sullivan to try to retake Newport from the British. This was what would become the Battle of Rhode Island, and the goal was, with the help of a French fleet, to recapture Newport and drive the British back to New York and then eventually back to England. So as the campaign was going on, it involved people from Bristol serving in all different types of roles. The local militia were deployed to the island, as well as the state troops that I mentioned before, and the Continental troops, which served in 2 different regiments, the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island. The 1st Regiment is sometimes known as the Black Regiment because it consisted largely of formerly enslaved people who had enlisted in exchange for their freedom. We know of multiple members of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment who served, who would have served at the Battle of Rhode Island from Bristol. One of them was Plato Van Dorn, who was actually worked as a tailor at the time of the war. We know this because there was a man in the family that enslaved him, Anthony Van Dorn, who worked as a tailor, and then during the war on some of the muster rolls, Plato Van Dorn is listed as being away from his regiment working as a tailor, presumably making uniforms for the regiment, as that was a common thing in this time period, where soldiers would work as tailors to outfit their regiments, making uniforms for them and things like that. There was also the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, which was commanded by Colonel Israel Angel, and they were also present and fought throughout the entire war, and we do know of multiple people from Bristol who served in that, including Daniel Maxfield, who is actually noteworthy for having gotten sick during the cold winter at Valley Forge, where there was a lot of illness, a lot of people dying from the cold and general sickness spreading throughout the camp. He was one of the many to get sick, although he was lucky enough to survive just in time to fight in the Battle of Monmouth. So, the Battle of Rhode Island, the Continental troops are making up the main front line, and the militia is behind the lines. The militia, even though the Rhode Island campaign didn't last that long. It was about a month, the entire thing. It lasted pretty much throughout the entire month of August. Even though it wasn't a super long period of time, the militia still did not serve that entire period of time as a whole. As they, as I mentioned before, they did 2 rotations of the platoons of the local militia company. They continued that while they were deployed elsewhere. So on the island, you would have half of the Bristol Militia Company there at any given time, and then when their time was up, they would switch off. So the captain of the company at the time, William Throop, was only actually present on Aquidneck Island for 10 days. There was at least one member of the company who was present for the entire campaign. His name was Joseph Monroe. He was 16 years old at the time, and the reason that he was present for the entire campaign was because he, at the start of the campaign, was actually serving as a replacement for his father. His father, Nathan Monroe, had sent him as a substitute, which he had actually done in previous militia service, even before Joseph was technically old enough to serve in the militia. But Joseph was sent as a substitute for the first portion of the campaign, and when the first draft of militia had ended and the rest of the men went home, Joseph himself was drafted, since he was now of age to be drafted in the militia, so he had to stay for the rest of the campaign, although that was not super common. One person I do have to mention, since we are here at Coggeshall Farm today, was James Coggeshall, a son of a former militia officer, Newby Coggeshall. James was also present with Captain William Throop during the Battle of Rhode Island, and served during that campaign, as well as guarding along the shoreline like the rest of his militia comrades. It is the main set of things going on around here. There are people from Bristol serving in the Continental Army throughout the entire war. They are present at the Battle of Yorktown in Jeremiah Olney's Rhode Island Battalion in 1781, because in the beginning of 1781, Rhode Island's 2 Continental regiments were combined into one, because they, once again, did not have enough men to have 2 separate regiments, so they just combined them, and that was their one regiment, which served at Yorktown and served until the end of the war and was disbanded. Most of the men went home in 1783. Most of the men who were still serving at that time. And another set of people I have to mention that don't really fit into the main narrative structure here are the privateers. Since Bristol is a seafaring town, there are ships going out from here. The main economy is all things to do with ships at this time period here in Bristol. There are a lot of merchants, sailors, there are a lot of slave ships that leave from Bristol, especially later going into the early 19th century with the DeWolf family, who you may have heard of. They were a very big slave trading family around here. And a lot of the more famous members of the DeWolf family, like James DeWolf, did actually participate in the Revolutionary War, not as soldiers, but as privateers. So they would go out on ships that had a letter of marque from the government in order to capture British merchant ships or occasionally military transports and bring them back in to Rhode Island's ports in order to sell them and get some money. Those privateer ships that the DeWolf sailed on were owned by their uncle, Simeon Potter. And that's most of what was going on in Bristol at this time period. We know out of the approximately 1,200 people living in Bristol at this time, we know of about 200 of them who participated in the war in some way, so it's a fairly high number. And in 1785, the Reverend Henry White, who was then the pastor of the Congregational Church in Bristol, and a Revolutionary War veteran himself, he served as a surgeon from Massachusetts during the war and moved here after. but he organized a celebration of the anniversary of independence, which led into what is now the Bristol 4th of July Parade, which is the longest running annual celebration of American independence anywhere in the country. And there were veterans of the war continuing to participate in Independence Day celebrations as long as they lived. Joseph Monroe, the 16-year-old at the Battle of Rhode Island, he died in 1849 at the age of 87. So there were people who had participated in the Revolution, living in town, taking part in all of the celebrations for a very long time after the war was over. And I believe it was in the 1836 parade, there is a mention of soldiers and officers of the Revolution being a contingent in the parade. So that they were an official part of it. Nelson Miller, who had served as a drummer throughout many portions of the war, was part of an Independence Day celebration in Providence in 1839. And one thing I actually forgot to mention about the privateers, Scion Martindale, who I mentioned at the beginning as a captain of the Army of Observation, he also later went on to command a privateer boat called the Bradford, which was capturing British ships and bringing them into Bristol in 1779. So I believe that is everything I had on my outline to talk to you about. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but thank you all for coming.